John chapter 7 is where we're going to go today. Across the pages of Scripture, there's a lot of stories that seem to stand out, classic Bible stories, that as you look at those classic Bible stories, we tend to think of them in standalone kinds of ways. Now, they don't stand alone. The Bible's a unified story that points to Jesus. But when we look at a story, think about Noah and the ark. We think, well, there's kind of a standalone story, or that's how we tend to view it. David and Goliath is one that we tend to think in that way, or parting of the Red Sea. But another one that might come to mind is Daniel and the lion's den. That story where Daniel was faithful to keep praying. He was about 90 years old at the time of that account. Some jealous men were trying to find fault, and so they framed him, set him up to fail, if you will, by setting up that praying is against the law. Daniel prayed anyway, and he was thrown to a den of lions. Well, the king thought a lot of Daniel, and he had a restless night. He rushed to the cave, the den, early that next morning, expecting that Daniel would have been torn to pieces by the hungry lions, unless there was some dramatic intervention. And in fact, that's what he found, a dramatic intervention. And Daniel was alive. The Lord had shut the lions' mouths. Now, as we're thinking about Jesus in John chapter 7, and as we go through the Gospel of John, we find that Jesus increasingly seems to be thrown into a lion's den. And today we're going to look at, in John chapter 7, two particular lion's dens where Jesus was thrust. And in these lion's dens, there's savage beasts, if you will, people that want to corner him, and ultimately they get him to the cross. And he endures that ultimate of lions' dens there. Now, Psalm 22 was a psalm written to describe Jesus' crucifixion. And it was written hundreds of years before the crucifixion. But I want to call your attention to chapter 22 of Psalm, verse 13. And it says there, they gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. Jesus was in the lion's den, if you will, both the increasing open hostility toward him and then ultimately at the crucifixion. So we're going to go to John 7. We're going to watch the temperature get turned up even hotter by his critics, by the mobs, by the enemies of Jesus. And in spite of how crazy things get around him, he remains focused, he remains on his mission. And it inspires us to continue to stay faithful to him no matter how crazy things are around us. So to get started, it's our hope as we go through the Gospel of John that you're gaining some sense of what this gospel is all about. That it's making sense, that you're able to piece together different things. John chapter 6. Feeding of the 5,000. John chapter 4, the woman at the well. John chapter 3, Nicodemus. I hope those things begin to happen. But there's a progression also that I want to offer to you just to take some notes on and to begin thinking through how John's gospel progresses. For example, as it begins, it's the period of consideration that's taking place there, where people are considering who Jesus is. It's chapters 1 through 4. That's where Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night and he says, who are you? We're trying to figure out who you are. And where the Samaritan woman says, you're a Jew asking me, a woman, a Samaritan woman, for a drink of water. Who are you? What's really going on here? So those first 4 chapters of John are a consideration of who he is. The second section of the book is a period of controversy. Chapters 5 and 6. Jesus heals a paralyzed man on the Sabbath day. And it just sends those religious leaders out of their minds that he would do such work on the Sabbath day. And so this controversy begins to build, and they begin plotting, how can they entrap him in who he is? The third period that happens would be a period of conflict, and that's where we're at today, beginning in chapter 7. It's chapter 7 through 11. And the heat really begins to turn up. And like in chapter 7 and verse 1, it says right there, Jesus didn't even go, he walked in Galilee. He didn't go to Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. So I'd say the heat's turned up there, wouldn't you, if the Jews are trying to kill him and he's aware of that. And so from chapter 7 through chapter 11, you won't believe how many times they threaten to kill him, and they're out to get him, and they're plotting and scheming. And over the next weeks, we're going to find that, and I hope in your own study, even you'd make note of some of those ways that they're out to get him for who he is. Chapter 12 would be what we'd call the period of crisis. Chapter 12 is Palm Sunday, where he goes into town, into Jerusalem, but he doesn't go in as the conquering king that they thought he was. And it turns to a crisis as he's on the verge of arrest and then ultimately crucifixion. So as we begin chapter 7, let me just make a note about the time frame that we have here. It is believed that chapter 7 is 6 months before the crucifixion. So we're building toward that climax, the crucifixion, 6 months before. Chapter 7, verse 2 gives us another clue about time frame. It says it was the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles at hand. The Feast of Tabernacles was one of the 3 Jewish feasts that were annual, that it was expected that Jewish men would travel to Jerusalem to commemorate. It went way back to the Old Testament when the Jews were traveling through the wilderness and God provided for them. They lived in tabernacles, tents, and they met with God at the tabernacle. And it commemorated the 40 years of God's provision. It happens in the fall, and so it's almost like our Thanksgiving, where they gathered together as a family, they gathered at the temple to worship, and they were giving thanks to God. It was a 7-day feast, and this chapter gives us some clues as to how the 7 days progressed. It's in chapter 14, where it'll say that it was the middle day of the feast. And then chapter 37 will say that it was the last day of the feast. And so just to give you a sense of what's happening in this chapter as we go through, it takes place over a week, and then it takes place in 2 locations. First in Galilee, which is up in northern part of Israel, and then it takes place in Judea, which is to the south. Galilee's in the north, Judea in the south, and in both of those locations are where it takes place. What I want us to really see is how the crowd reacts to who Jesus is and how the crowd reacts to what Jesus has to say. Because there's a lot of unbelief going on then, just as there's a lot of unbelief going on today in our world. So what does unbelief look like? We would start off, since we said the pressure's ramping up and they're out to kill him, we'd say, first of all, the unbelief looks like threatening. Threatening is going on there. The religious crowd is threatening to kill Jesus, and there's plotting and scheming and planning on how they're going to make it happen. If you read from chapter 7 through chapter 11 in John, you'll be so surprised how many times it says Jesus is being threatened. They're working on how to threaten him. You know, in our day, the enemies of Christ don't have to come after every one of us. All they have to do is go after a random baker or a photographer or a school or a school official to make all the rest of us nervous, to make us all a little bit hesitant. All they have to do is go after one business and make us all a little bit hesitant. I remember a handful of years ago, there was some religious-based law, some biblical morality point of view law in the state of Indiana. And reporters fanned out all over the state to see if they would serve a rehearsal dinner meal for a same-sex wedding. And they went to dozens and dozens of cities asking hundreds of restaurants, and then they finally found a pizza place. How many people have pizza at their rehearsal dinners? But they found one, and so they blew that up in the news with threats, and all they had to do is make everybody else nervous. They didn't have to threaten everybody. And in this case, the followers of Jesus get threatened and afraid because Jesus himself is threatened. But there's another opposition, if you will, what unbelief looks like. And this one's pretty interesting. Look at verse 3. Jesus' brothers therefore said to him, "Depart from here and go into Judea, so that your disciples there also may see the work that you're doing. For no one does anything in secret, while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For even his brothers did not believe in him. Now, if we take that at face value, we're looking at, they're like, hey, why don't you go spread your message somewhere else? But it's coming from a viewpoint of unbelief. They're mocking him. They're making fun of him. I have written in my margin, sarcasm here. Hey, Jesus, if you think you're really big time, why don't you go to the big city of Jerusalem and show off some of that stuff? You're here in the backwaters of Galilee. You think you're a big fish. Well, this is a small pond here. Why don't you go to the big city and see what kind of fish you are there? That's what his family's saying to him. Even if you convince these Galileans, there's nobody here that's all that sophisticated. That doesn't prove anything about who you are. That's Jesus' own brothers who didn't believe in him. Jesus' own brothers. Why don't you go show your stuff there? Now, I will add a little note here that 2 of the New Testament letters were written by Jesus' brothers, James and Jude. After the resurrection, they came around. Here it says even his brothers didn't believe in him, but after the resurrection, they came around. Now, the first lion's den here that Jesus faced was in his own family up in Galilee. It's possible that when you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you were surprised to find that the primary opposition came from your family. That they started mocking you and making fun of you. What do you think? You're better than us now? You think you're so good? It's not going to last. You'll be back among us. You'll be back in part of this. You've abandoned your family. And you begin to hear, and sadly, tragically, far too many hear mocking and ridicule that comes from their own families. And it's shocking because you're thinking, why wouldn't they be excited that I'm teaching biblical morality to my kids? Why wouldn't they be excited that my marriage is stronger than it was? Why wouldn't they be excited that I'm around some intentional fathers? Why wouldn't they be excited for me? But it happened here. Verse 10, 11, and 12 gives us a couple more. Jesus did go to Jerusalem, to that lion's den. Verse 10, when his brothers had gone up, then Jesus also went up to the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. And then the Jews sought him at the feast, and they said, "Where is he?" And there were some complaining among the people concerning him. Some said he is good, and others said, no, on the contrary, he deceives the people. So there's 2 more expressions of unbelief that we find here. One is compromising, where they say he is good. They're not buying in. They're not committing. We hear that in our day. He's a good man. He's a teacher. He's a good moral he teaches that golden rule and all of that. He's a good man. It's compromise. We should love people the way Jesus does. Jesus doesn't judge. And we hear these statements, the Jesus that we want is different than the Jesus who is. We've talked about that over the last weeks. And there's a superficial acceptance that happens. And that's what some of the people are doing. They're having this back and forth and there's this complaining. But they're saying, he's just a good man. Others are accusing him. They're calling him a liar. He deceives people. What strong words there. He deceives people. Now, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. It was C.S. Lewis who gave the three options. He's either Lord, he really is the Messiah, or he's a liar, he knows he's not, but he's deceiving people, or he's a lunatic. He really thinks he is, and he's not. So he captured that, and people here were making that accusation of Jesus that he was a liar. And he's not. So I want to offer a couple of observations at this point. The first observation is this: opposition to Christ, his message, and his messengers is not new. It's always been there. We're following a person that they crucified. Why do we think that our life is going to be easy and that nobody's ever going to make fun, nobody's going to tease us, nobody's going to be opposed to that? The symbol for our faith is a cross. It was an execution tool, method. So why would we think it would be any different for us? Why would we think it would be easy and smooth sailing? It's always been there. It's always been a part of it. Do you know that of Jesus' 12 disciples, 10 of them died as martyrs? Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17 gives a very picturesque description of Satan's opposition to the followers of Jesus. It talks about the dragon, Satan, making war against the people of God. The offspring of the woman, making war with the people of God. So the opposition to Christ and his message, it's always been there. Let's not panic. Let's not get scared. In fact, we would make this observation: God is sovereignly in control. God's working a plan. Do you think God got nervous when this opposition to Christ increased? Do you think he got nervous when the heat was turned up? God's not surprised. Now, the cross seems like the ultimate defeat, but have you ever noticed our cross is empty? The crosses are empty because he rose from the dead. It actually, what Satan thought was the greatest defeat turned out to be the greatest victory because he lives. Now, any power that is exercised by this world is borrowed, is temporary, and is desperate. It's borrowed because the ultimate authority is the sovereign Lord. It's temporary because we ultimately know how the story ends. And it's desperate because he's a cornered rat that is trying to take down as many people as he can. Another observation: there's always going to be a remnant of believers. That's a beautiful description throughout the prophets in the Old Testament. As Israel was sinful and declining spiritually and politically, there was always a remnant of believers, and the prophets would talk about God's remnant of believers. Every now and then, a survey will come out about people today being less religious than they've ever been. More spiritual than ever, but less religious and not going to church as much. They sometimes call them the nones, N-O-N-E-S. They have no religious affiliation, sometimes termed the rise of the nones. And so it's possible for Christians to think the sky is falling. It's going to end. It's almost over. Throughout history, God has always had a remnant. Elijah's a beautiful story. He's depressed, he's discouraged. He says to God, God, I'm the only one that's serving you. I'm the only one following you. Nobody else. I'm the only one. And God says to Elijah, it's in 1 Kings 19, he says, Elijah, I have 7,000 people that have not bowed the knee to this wicked king and his idols. I have so many. The lie of the devil, one of the many lies, is that you're alone, you're the only one. You might as well give up too. Curse God and die was Job's wife's message to him. There's always a remnant of believers. God is always at work. The sky isn't falling. God's working all over the world. He's working in Lynn County. He's working in so many families' lives and individuals' lives. One more observation in thinking about this. We know how the story ends. We know how the story ends. At some point in time, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Now, we don't know when that is. We long for that day. But there will come that day. So how do we move from unbelief to belief? What moves us from that? I'd be curious what it is that moved you from unbelief to belief. What pushed you over the line? Was there some description about who Jesus Christ is? Some truth from Scripture? A friend that came into your life and spoke the right thing at the right time? What was it? In this long text of chapter 7, Jesus gives some reasons why it would make sense to go all in and move so past he's a good man, he's a good moral teacher. Where do we find it? Verse 16 to start there. Jesus answered these folks and he said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine, whether it is from God or whether I speak on my own authority." Verse 18. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. So Jesus gives us some reasons to believe, and one of them is his origin. Where he came from. He came from heaven, and he speaks about being sent from God. He speaks of the one who sent him. He was alive long before he was born. He was alive in eternity past. And Jesus knows as he took every step and as the mocking came and the accusations came, and there were people, he came to his own and his own did not receive him, John 1 says. But he knows as all that's going on, he has nothing to gain because he came from God. And he has nothing to prove because he is the Son of God and he was sent by God. And he has nothing to lose. He knows who he is. He came from heaven and he's on a mission from God. He was sent from God. The number of times, multiple times in this chapter, Jesus speaks of being sent from God on a mission. And his mission was twofold. One, to train 12 men to be world changers and to spread the message of Christ. And then secondly, to die for the sins of the world. The same idea is repeated in John chapter 7, verse 28. Jesus cried out as he taught in the temple, saying, "You both know me and you know where I am from. And I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know, but I know him." Jesus was confident about this, his origin and his identity. His origin and identity, his origin and his purpose. Think about in our culture, the attack on our origin, that we didn't come from God, that we evolved from some primordial soup. What's that say about us? That we're just the product of chance, random processes. That we're just some higher mammals, all we are. What kind of origin is that compared to created in the image of God? Made in the image of God. But then that origin determines our purpose. When you understand the origin of something, you begin to understand the purpose of it. Every now and then there's some conversation about critical theory. And critical theory has been applied in a lot of different areas. If you study the origin of critical theory, then you find out it was communists in Germany that couldn't gain any traction in the 30s. So they came over here and they found traction in college environments. Origin, purpose, identity. When we study our origin, and we find out who Jesus Christ is and where he came from and the mission that he was on, then we get a sense of who is he and what his purpose is and his identity is. That's when we find ours. And far too many are having to make up their own purpose, make up their own identity because they've lost sight of their origin and how God made them and who God made them to be. When the scriptures begin, in the beginning, God, that's where it starts. It's not in the beginning me, it's in the beginning God. A third thing about Jesus, 7:31, many of the people believed in Jesus and said, when the Christ comes, will he do more signs than these which this man has done? Like, we don't see how anybody's going to do more than this. This guy's been doing so many miracles. So Jesus' miracles is another one. The miracles of Jesus. And then verse 37. On that last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And this he spoke concerning the Spirit, whom those believing in him would receive. For the Holy Spirit was not yet given, he had not yet been glorified. The changed lives that are impacted because Jesus Christ has entered into that life speak loudly and boldly in testimony to who Jesus Christ is. And they give us reason to believe because spiritual death has been replaced with spiritual life. And anxiety has been replaced with peace, and despair has been replaced with hope, and guilt's been replaced with forgiveness, and fear's been replaced with security. Because when Christ comes into our life, that thirst is quenched, that longing is satisfied, and it's an overflowing spring of life that occurs in us. Oh, thank God for the life change that happens in people. So no matter what kind of lion's den you find yourself in, whether it's family, whether it's coworkers, whether it's a lion's den of political pressures that you sense or feel, whether it's a lion's den of fellow students or a school environment where you're at. How about if we walk with the confidence that we're following the Christ? We know who Jesus is, where he came from, and what his mission is, and we're drawing our identity and our purpose from him. Let's proceed with confidence, no matter what's happening around us. Would you stand with me, please? With heads bowed and eyes closed, and our worship team's coming here to the front. We're going to close with a song here in just a moment, but I want you to think through the anxiety, the guilt, the fear, the intimidation maybe that you've experienced, the hesitation to be all in and commit for whatever reason. The threats don't have to come to all of us. They just need to come to a few, and then we all get antsy. How about in your own heart today? God, I'm confident in who Jesus Christ is, and I want to walk in that confidence in my Christian life. Father in heaven, may you see in this body a confidence in you May you see in us, we've moved from unbelief to belief, and whatever it was that moved any of us over the line of faith, thank you for that. God, I pray that our lives would be a testimony because of the changes that have happened in us, a testimony to who Jesus Christ is, to Christ's origin and his purpose. Thank you for how the story ends. Thank you for how you're at work in so many ways.